Kayla and I were discussing about how we might be pretty slim tonight with the knowing how we have a couple sick, we have the Brewers traveling, of course Don out with the hip surgery, and we're worried, but wonderful to get together with you all and have visitors. Get to see Fred out again after not getting to see him for so long. So just so pleased that we are able to meet together on Sundays, and I am edified and built up with the people we have with us today. So I want to welcome our visitors and welcome Fred. It's wonderful to see you again. And hopefully, as this pandemic hopefully wanes down a little bit, if it continues on its current trajectory, we'll see many more friendly faces out in the coming months. We also wanted to mention that Tim had let me know that he had to meet Sarah to drop the girls off this evening, so that's where he is at this evening. He was here this morning, which is great to see him as well, and the girls, of course, as well. But he wanted me to pass that along, that he planned to be out with us, but he couldn't because of the meeting times. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into this deeper dive, as I'm calling it, about the enemies of Israel. And I didn't set out really to do 2 Old Testament lessons in a row, but nonetheless, that is what we're going to do this evening. Because what I wanted to do before I even knew that I was going to be talking about Moses this morning is I wanted to do kind of a study of Ruth. Lily and I have been working our way through the Bible very, very slowly over the last year or so, one chapter at a time each night, and we have just got to Ruth. And I was going through that story, and there's so many wonderful things in it, but at the very beginning of that, of course, it mentions that Ruth is a Moabite. I didn't know too much about the country of Moab or the surrounding countries. I felt like that's something I should really understand well before I were to present something about Ruth. But in researching some things about Moab and the Moabite nation, I came across several things about the other enemies of Israel as well. I thought it'd be good for all of us to kind of review these countries, these peoples that constantly were at odds with Israel. So that's what we're going to do this evening. So the 3 that we're going to look at this evening, and there are a few more, especially notably missing from this list, I think, is the Philistines, especially from the rise of Israel, the nation of Israel, and the kingdom of Judah. And let's see how this map's showing up. Looks like it's doing decently there. So the area you see kind of in between all of the colored areas is the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And these kind of enemy nations surround them. We can see the Philistines there on the left-hand side of the screen in red, and then in orange you can see the kingdom of Ammon and the kingdom of Moab in purple, as we were discussing, and then at the bottom of the screen the kingdom of Edom in yellow. So I kind of wanted to break this down of where these came from. I didn't realize, but basically all 3 of these nations we're going to be looking at, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, all come from the same line. If you think about it, you think of your perhaps your children and their cousins, those types of things, or perhaps you're thinking of your cousins, looking up to a grandfather or something like that. These all come from the same lineage area of Terah, Terah being the father of Abraham. I think it's pretty interesting. We see these large nations of people were developed because of the not chosen lineage of Christ, right? But the other members of that family. So we look at the lineage we're perhaps more familiar with. We have Terah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is the names in green. They look to be a little bright on your screen above me. But those are the lineage we talk about the most often, right? Because that is what led to Christ. That is what leads to the nation of Israel, literally, as Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and then his 12 sons make up the 12 tribes, which would become the inhabitants of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, as depicted on the screen. But in addition to those, Terah had 2 children, Abraham and Haran, or Abram, I guess, and Haran. And Haran had a nephew that we're more familiar with. His name was Lot. And then Lot had 2 children, Moab, or probably more than that for sure, but the 2 that we're going to be looking at tonight, literally Moab and Ben-Ammi. And then, of course, we're more familiar with Isaac and his children, the twins, Esau and Jacob. And these are where we see these kingdoms coming from. And we're going to look at each one individually this evening. But what I wanted to point out from the very beginning is you would think with such a close lineage to God, right? These people were very close, and even though Lot seems pretty far away, perhaps Moab and Ben-Ammi, they seem a little bit distant. we can remember that Abraham kind of took Lot in as almost a son, right, in his travels. We read a lot about Abraham and Lot going around together during when Abraham was entering Canaan the first time. So you think he would have a pretty good understanding of God, and therefore Moab and Ben-Ammi should be right there as well, right, with that understanding of God. But that's not really what happened. The descendants who did not follow God became a problem. And that's what we're going to see, that each one of these, at least their descendants, did. So let's go ahead and look at a verse that kind of shows us this very simply in 1 Samuel. We're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 47. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 47, it says, "And when Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them." We can see here what happened to these people, and perhaps it's very simple for us to see that Moab becomes the Moabites, right? We're going to see that Esau becomes Edom, and Ben-Ammi becomes Ammon, these nations. And we can see by the time that Saul comes on the scene, which is after the judges, of course, when they establish the kings, these were all enemies. And even before this, as we're going to see as we dig deeper into each one, these are enemies of God, enemies of God's people, the kingdom of Israel. So let's go ahead and look at the Edomites to begin with, since Esau is probably the one we're more familiar with the stories of Esau and Jacob. We can see here that Esau kind of started going the wrong direction very early on, even in his story, by looking in Genesis chapter 26, verse 34 to begin. So let's go ahead and look at that. Genesis chapter 26, verse 34 says, "When Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Uri, the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah." So we can already see here that there were some mistakes being made. And although they didn't live in exactly the under the Mosaic law, it hadn't been authored yet, as we were studying Moses this morning. This is before that time. There was a negative ideology of marrying outside of your clan, right? Marrying the surrounding people. We can see that it caused problems here for Isaac and Rebekah, and we're going to see even more in chapter 28. So let's go ahead and continue this thought over in chapter 28. And verse 80 is definitely incorrect. So let's look at verse 8. Let's actually back up to verse 6. It says, "Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take a wife from there." So Jacob had kind of determined where Isaac had determined where Jacob was going to get his wife, and that he blessed him because of that. "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women." And that he was blessed, and that he blessed him, he directed him, "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women," which is exactly what Esau did. And picking up in verse 7, it says, "And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and gone to Paddan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please Isaac his father, Esau went to Ishmael and took as his wife, besides the wives he had, Mahalathah, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth." So we can see here this idea that Esau was already kind of doing the wrong thing. It's pretty clear here that Jacob did the right thing. And what did he do? He went to his own people to get his wife. He did as Isaac wanted him to do, what was the intent of his father and mother. And exactly the opposite is what Esau did. He went to the Canaanite women. "You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women." That is what he said to Jacob. Isaac said to Jacob. But that is what we see Esau did. In addition to this, Esau sold his birthright. In the story we're not going to look into too deeply, but we see that this put him at odds with Jacob. He was kind of tricked into selling his birthright, and he also lost the blessing as well, which put him on a pretty much warpath with Jacob. So let's look at that here in Genesis chapter 27, verse 41. So just back a chapter there from where we were. And it says, "Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, 'The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob.' But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise and flee to Laban, my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away. So we can see here this idea that maybe this is the reason that Edom was against the Israelites, right? This age-old brotherly rivalry. That might be what we think happened, but we can see that that's not actually the case. This isn't the cause of their problems with each other, because if we turn over a few chapters to Genesis chapter 32, we can see that this conflict gets resolved. So let's go ahead and pick up Genesis 32, verses 6 through 11. It says, And messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you. And there were 400 men with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. We just heard that Esau wanted to kill Jacob, right? And now he's got a large army, quite a few years later here, coming to meet him. I mean, it sounds like an army, 400 men. We're going to see that's not exactly what it is. But he says he divided his people, this is Jacob, who were with him, the flocks and the herds and the camels, into 2 camps, thinking if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, Return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. Am I not worthy, at the least, of all these deeds of steadfast love and all faithfulness that you have shown to your servant? For with only my staff I crossed the Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers, with my children, or with the children. So you can see here that this fear, the fear that had caused Jacob to leave many years before, was still there, very, very much on the front of his mind, right? With this idea that Esau is still probably going to be pretty mad. But that's not actually the case. We look in verse 33. Let's read the first 9 verses there. Chapter 33 of Genesis, picking up in verse 1. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants, and he put the servants with their children in front. Then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, Who are these with you? And Jacob said, The children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the servants drew near, and they and their children bowed down, and Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And at last Joseph and Rachel drew near and bowed down. And Esau said, What do you mean by all this company that I met? Jacob answered, To find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. So we can see here that Esau and Jacob are on pretty good terms at this point in life, right? So we would think that there wouldn't be so much problem between Edom and the Israelites, but that's not the case. Just as we read about this morning, as the Pharaoh that arose in Moses' time did not know Joseph, that is kind of the same idea of what happened to Edom. But just to verify here, I've been saying this, but I just wanted to hit a quick verse here to show that Esau is truly Edom. It says that in the Bible. I'm not inferring that. That is a direct quotation here from Genesis 36, 8 through 9. And that reads, in Genesis 36, picking up in verse 8, So Esau settled in the hill country of Seir. Esau is Edom. These are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites, in the hill country of Seir. So there makes it very clear that Esau is the country, or the people of Edom, the Edomites. But the next time we see the Edomites, we don't have this great reunion that we just saw with Esau. And that happens in Numbers chapter 20. So in Numbers chapter 20, we're going to pick up in verse 14. So we can see here, this is actually right after Moses struck the rock that we were talking about this morning. But after that, and after Aaron had passed away, or Aaron is going to pass away here in a minute, Moses sent messengers, picking up in verse 14 here in Numbers chapter 20. Moses sent messengers to Kadesh, to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel. So we just saw that this relationship was good. That's why it says, thus says your brother Israel. They had that common lineage. You know all the hardship that we have met, how our fathers went down to Egypt and lived in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians dwelt harshly with us and our fathers.
And when we cried to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. And here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your land. We will not pass through field or vineyard or drink water from a well. We will go along the king's highway, and we will not turn aside to the right hand or the left hand until we have passed through your territory. But Edom said to him, You shall not pass through, lest I come out with a sword against you. And the people of Israel said to him, We will go up by your highway, and if we drink your water, and I and my livestock, then we will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. But he said, You shall not pass through. And Edom came out against them with a large army and a strong force. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory. So Israel turned away from him. So you can see that brotherly love that was rekindled between Jacob and Esau did not carry through with their descendants. And this is going to turn out to be a pretty problematic thing. This would have been a pretty direct route for the Israelite nation to get away from Egypt and toward their direction, but God had turned them away through the Edomites. We can see here that this caused some problems. So let's go ahead and look at Numbers chapter 21, just from a quick spot there. Aaron passes away, and in Numbers 21, verse 4, it says, From Mount Hor they set out by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses, Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. So we can see here partially this problem with the Edomites. The problem the Edomites caused is not just they couldn't go directly through it, but it caused the Lord's people to be upset, be angry, and turn away from God in a way. This is problematic. And the last thing we'll look about with Edom is in Deuteronomy chapter 2, in the first 8 verses there. We can see that even though Edom defied Israel, they were still protected by God. And in verse 1 it says, Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea, as the Lord told me. And for many days we traveled around Mount Seir. So this is kind of picking up where we just left off, even though we've skipped quite a bit. He's recounting the story here. And the Lord said to me, You have traveled around the mountain country long enough. Turn northward and command your people. You are about to pass through the territory of your brothers, the people of Esau, who lived in Seir. And they will be afraid of you, so be very careful. Do not contend with them, for I will not give you any of their land, no, not so much as the sole of the foot to tread on, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. You shall purchase food from them with money, and that you may eat, and you shall also buy water from them with money, that you may drink. For the Lord your God has blessed you and all the works of your hands, and he knows you're going through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked nothing. So we went on and away from our brothers, the people of Esau, who lived in Seir, away from Arabah, rode to Elath and Ezion Geber, and turned and went into the direction of the wilderness of Moab. So we can see here that even though the Edomites were defying Israel, God was still with them. He had promised Esau this area, and he wasn't going to give it up. He wasn't going to allow this to be part of the property of the Israelites. As we saw in that map, they continued even as Israel took control of the land. So I think we can learn here that God honors his promises as one takeaway from the Edomites, but also that we need to continue to follow God. Another enemy of God is the Ammonites. So I wanted to look back at the story quickly here of the story of Ben-Ami and Moab. It's not one of the best stories. We've been talking about in the Wednesday evening class the idea of the Bible. One of the ways we can tell the Bible is truthful because it includes things that are embarrassing or things that you wouldn't normally include here. And there's quite a bit in this story that you wouldn't choose to include unless it was true. So we're going to skip even some of that, of what happened to the angels who came to talk to Lot, but they're trying to get Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah right before it's going to be destroyed. And that's what we're going to pick up here in chapter 19 of Genesis in verse 15 through 17. It says, As the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered, and the man seized him and his wife and 2 daughters by the hand, and the Lord, being merciful to him, they brought him out and set him outside the city. And they brought them out. One said, Escape for your life, do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley, escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. But as we might remember, this isn't exactly what happened. If we go down to verse 23, they did not follow what the angels had told them. It says, and when the sun had risen on the earth, picking up in 23 here, risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire, and the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew the cities and the valley, and all the inhabitants in the city, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So we can see here that Lot lost his wife. He's only escaping with his 2 daughters. And then, continuing on in the bottom of this chapter, 19:30 through 38, we can see that there's a great abomination that led to the birth of these 2 children, Moab and Ben-Ammi. Picking up in verse 30, it says, Now Lot went up to Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in to lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. And the next day the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that you may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and also the younger arose and lay down with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. And the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So we can see this problematic, how sin creates problems even for the Israelite nation in the future. This sin that shouldn't have happened created these 2 enemy nations when these people should have known better. Lot was close to Abraham. He was close to God, so close that literally in this same chapter, God is saving him from this great calamity. And this is how they repay him. And this became a problem ongoing, as we could see from these verses. I'm not going to turn to all these, but we can see that they were often engaged with battle with Israel. It's mentioned in 1 Samuel 11:11, 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 1, and 2 Chronicles 27 and verse 5. They're constantly fighting. And this is over a pretty good span if we think about it, right? In 1 Samuel, the kings, and even down into the latter kings here in 2 Chronicles. But let's pick up some more about the Ammonites, how they even further cause problems for the children of Israel in 1 Kings. And this is going to be a common thread through both the Moabites and the Ammonites. But let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1. It says, Now King Solomon, so we're down a few decades, or maybe even quite a bit far down the line. The kings have been established, Saul and David, and now Solomon. And it says in 1 Kings 11, verse 1, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonite, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. But Solomon clung to these in love. This is exactly what we're going to see happen here. If we turn just a few verses down to verse 5. In verse 5 it says, For Solomon went after the Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So we can see here that these children of Lot did not stay with God. They did not follow after, even seeing this great thing that the angels rescued Lot and his daughters. They did not believe in God. They have this new god, Milcom. And even here, I think this is another interesting point, but we can see this was entered into basically the Israelite nation. This false religion not only plagued those who were not following God, but it entered back and was difficult for the Israelites, caused them problems, as we're going to see too with the kingdom of Moab here in a second. But also, even in Nehemiah, we think about after the Israelites were taken into captivity, or it's not even Israelites anymore, because it's just Judah coming back now. Half of the Israelite nation, or more than half of the tribes of Israel have been wiped out. Judah's coming back. We still see the Ammonites being a thorn in their side in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 7. But when Shalat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdites heard that they were repairing the walls of Jerusalem and going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to close, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion in it. So these Ammonites, this problematic nation, continued to be a problem basically for the entirety of the Old Testament to the Israelite nation and the nation of Judah after the Israelites were separated and destroyed. I didn't realize that, so I wanted to pass that along, basically how long these enemies were a problem. So the Ammonites provided a constant test for Israel, and unfortunately they failed it quite often, as we see the example of Solomon. And the Moabites were also right there with them. To finish up the lesson, let's look at the country of Moab quickly here. We can see they also chose not to worship God in Numbers chapter 21. So Numbers 21, verse 29. We see here the name of their God. It says, "Woe to you, O Moab! You are undone, O people of Chemosh. He has made his sons fugitives and his daughters captives, and to an Amorite king, Shion." So we can see in Numbers, Moabites weren't posing a big problem because they already had a big problem of their own, and that was the Amorite king at the time. But we can see here, why I wanted to turn here, is it shows that they were already worshiping their god, Chemosh, not the God of Lot, not the God of Abraham. They should have been worshiping. And this caused problems. In fact, even in the Judges, we see that Moab kind of recovered from this when they were basically being conquered by someone else, because in Judges, we see that they had conquered Israel. So let's look at this story in Judges quickly here. Judges chapter 3. We're going to pick up in verse 12, the story of Ehud. It says, "The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms," which I believe is an indication of Jerusalem there. So we can see that Moab was over even the Israelites for a time. We'll stop the reading there, but it continues to go on to see how the judges, God's judges, delivered Israelites from this captivity during this time. But there was a time, because of the sins, because they fell short, because of these surrounding countries and the bad influence they had on him, that Moab conquered Israel. And one of the ways they did this was the plaguing Israel with false worship. And Moab was, God was with Israel. They could not be defeated directly. And there's some great stories about that. And reading about the stories of Ruth, I could, which I'm trying to set up with this lesson. I think I'm also going to set up a lesson about Balak and Balaam, because that's an interesting story as well concerning Moab. This idea that the Moabites wanted any way they could to beat Israel, but there was no way to beat them. God was going to bless them as long as Israel was doing the right thing. But we can see here how they finally beat them was to get them to do the wrong thing. And they did that very well. In two examples here. Let's look at Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 9 for the first example. In Numbers 25, picking up in verse 1, it says, "And while Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab." So we just talked about how they weren't supposed to marry these daughters of the foreign lands there, but that's what they did. That's what they were doing. That's what it's saying here. And these invited the people to sacrifice to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the chiefs among the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel." And Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Each of you kill those men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor." And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family. And in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance of tent of meeting, when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he arose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced them both, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. So why we read there to the end is I wanted to show that this had consequences even then. When they turned away, they had a plague that was driven down on them, that they lost 24,000 people. But they didn't learn their lesson, as we can see here in 1 Kings. So we can turn back to 1 Kings in the kind of the same area we were just in. We were reading about Solomon and what he did. 1 Kings chapter 11, and in verse 7 this time it said, "Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods." So there's a lot we could talk about Molech as well, if we were talking about the Ammonites there, which I didn't go over. But wanted to focus on Chemosh here, this idea that Solomon constructed a high place for him, right? And this was a thorn in the side of Israel for 291 years, this erection of this high place. I think this is an interesting thing. This is exactly why God said, was so harsh with the people of Israel, so told them to be so harsh with the people in the land because they were constantly turned away by these other nations. We can see that was finally taken down in 2 Kings 23 in verse 13 by Josiah. Go ahead and turn to that. And it says, "And the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem to the south of the mountain of corruption, which Solomon the king of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites." So we can see here these were around from Solomon to Josiah, and that was about 290 years that these people were led astray by their king, who was entangled with these women, these problematic nations that surrounded Israel. So Moab is a primary adversary of Israel, and I think there's a lot more with Moab, as we're going to look at, probably not next week, or maybe not even the week after that, but we're going to set up the story of Ruth with this idea of how problematic Moab was, and also the story of Balak and Balaam. So we can look forward to that in the coming months here. But hopefully we can gain a better understanding of the problematic things that it is when we turn away from God by looking at these Old Testament stories, and how easy it is to, even if you know the right thing, if you do not worship it, your children and their children's children will not know the truth, which is what happened here as we examined Esau and Lot. What they did not pass down accurately the things of God, and therefore their nations, their descendants, became a huge problem for those trying to worship God. This can be true as us as well, even today. So hopefully this has been interesting and informative. Obviously, it's mostly an academic study as we look back at the Old Testament and learn more as we dive deeper into understanding the things of the Old Testament. It doesn't lend itself directly to an invitation, but I think what we can see is that there are going to be punishments for those who don't follow God. That's what we see constantly with Israel as they fell into the trap over and over again with these nations around them. There was nothing that Israel couldn't do when they were doing the right thing. But when they didn't, bad things happened, from plagues to being led to captivity, all of these different things because they weren't doing as God has instructed. And that's the same as it is then as it is now. We can see the wages of sin is always death, but we have the free gift of God, eternal life, because of Christ Jesus, our Lord, as we see in Romans 6:23. And I encourage you, if we have fallen short in any way, to repent, because as we didn't address too much, but as is indicated by these Israelites continuing to fall away, they were restored as well when they repented. And we have that ability today as well to repent and pray for forgiveness. And God is willing to do that for us through the giving of his Son. So I encourage you, if there's anything we can do for you this evening, to come forward now as we stand and sing the invitation song.